Okay, so welcome to session 8, and we're going to be looking at the first part of week 5 in the Jim Wilkin book, but we're actually only going to discuss the questions from day 1, because about half of the video is devoted to that, so I thought we'll save the rest of it. So if you got stuck this week, it was really funny. Last night, all the ladies that were there last night said that they didn't have time to do the homework this week. This week was just one of those crazy things. And Jen started off her video by saying, now this is the point in the course when a lot of people stop doing homework. And he said, busted. But anyway, so we're going to look at just day 1 of week 5. But before we look at the questions, I just want to make sure that you noted a couple of things. I thought on page 67, when she gives the introduction to the week, I thought she had a couple of very helpful points. We're getting into the part of Exodus, as you saw, if you did have a chance to look at the homework. It has all these, well, kind of unusual kind of rules. It sounds strange. Some of them don't even sound like they're fair. You know, when you look at them. As you read this week, you may find some of the commands to be confusing, alarming, or just plain weird. Take a deep breath. As a person living in a very different time and very different culture, you need to go slowly and allow what you know about the character of God to guide your interpretation. So in other words, don't read a rule and say, that isn't fair, God isn't being just in this case. Well, we know God is just. We know He is good. Remember what you know about God. He is just, wise, loving, gracious, merciful, and good. And we're going to work together to place these commands that seem so strange in their cultural context and to examine why God put them in place. The other thing she said is the next paragraph. She said, also understand that the commands of the Book of the Covenant were intended to be used by Israel's judges as they handled legal disputes. So that eye for an eye thing, that wasn't to be taken by every individual Israelite. You don't go around poking out other people's eyes because they did that to you, okay? You take it to the judge and he determines what the punishment will be. Thus, mercy and grace are largely absent in the wording of these laws. Well, they're also largely absent from our own law books, because what's the law? It says this is what you should do, and if you don't do it, this is the consequence. It's up to the judge to decide if there are extenuating circumstances that might allow for a little mercy and grace. The law just says what's right and wrong and what the consequences are. So, these laws were also intended to give the Israelites wisdom and guidance about living faithfully before the Lord in every area of life. And in that regard, they're somewhat similar to what you find in Proverbs. So I just thought those were two helpful mindsets to have with you as you read through this section. So having said that, let's look then at the answer or the questions on day 1. Generally speaking, that opening few verses, 22 to 26 of chapter 20, what did it deal with? Relationship with God or others or property? God. Okay. Talked about the altar. Talked about not having, building, make idols of silver and gold and so on. So which of the 10 commandments is being expanded upon in this passage? Second, for sure. Probably all 3 of the first 3, but definitely specifically the second one. And then when he talked about the altars, he told them they could make them of one of 2 materials. What was that? Stone, but what about the stone? Uncut. It had to be just as it came from the field. Just as you found it, you put it in place. Or earth. Okay. And then she said, does that seem like things that are worthy of the majesty of God? What was your reaction to saying make the things of stone and earth. And again, this is what you think, there's no right or wrong answer.
Oh, he made them.
He made them, okay, all right, they're part of God's creation. And so they're, if he's satisfied, who are we?
It's seeming like it's not for our great God. He should have jewels and whatever, and gold and all that should be on the altar.
Yeah.
Well, he made Adam out of dust.
Yeah.
The dust came from the earth.
Yeah. So, and that was his crowning creation.
Yeah.
So, and I think there are good reasons for making them this way, but Jen will address that more, so I'll leave that for the discussion. And then she did point out in question 4, pagan worshipers built altars made of smoothly hewn stone. It was sort of like they were trying to make it beautiful, and maybe it was a pride thing. Look at this gorgeous thing that we have built, this ziggurat. You know. Their altars were often constructed as steps, like the Tower of Babel. Pagans sometimes exposed themselves and even performed sex acts on the steps as part of their worship. So I think one thing God is saying very clearly is, my altar is to be nothing like those altars. Yeah, it's to be a holy place, and I am to be approached in a holy manner. So maybe that's a reason too, for the contrast between these. Because if you just look at the buildings, the ziggurats are impressive structures, you know. Okay, and then she had you look at chapter 21, verses 1 to 32. What did that section deal with? Relationship with God, others, okay, other people. So, which of the 10 commandments did you find expanded upon in this section?
Shall not covet.
Don't covet. Don't
Don't
steal.
kill.
Don't murder. Yeah, yeah. So those ones that how we treat other people. And then she gets into this thing about slavery, you know, and says some of you, what you read in this particular section in particular can be alarming to us, because we tend to think of slavery as what took place in our own country, as what took place in Africa when people were kidnapped. You know, what happened to Joseph, his brothers sold him to foreigners who hauled him off, and then he got resold and so on. But she says, by contrast, the term slave here can also be translated servant, and describes an indentured servant. Even that sounds strange to us, because we don't have people that do that either, as far as I know. But a fellow Hebrew who sells him or herself into servitude for a set period of time to repay debt. And again, she's going to expand quite a bit on that, and I think what she had to say was very helpful.
You know, if you know your history, you'll learn about Scotland and Ireland. A lot of children, 7 and 8 years old, their parents sold them. They were indentured slaves to get to America.
Okay.
And so when they came to America, they had 10 years that they had to work before they became free.
Right.
And so it wasn't just slaves in Africa or whatever.
Right.
It was a common thing. If you were poor
Right.
and you wanted to go someplace else, that's the only way you could go.
Yeah. And it was willingly entered into. That's a big difference.
I mean, small children, I remember reading about a 7-year-old boy. The mother died, and there were a few kids, and the father couldn't support them, so he sold them, and he indentured them at the age of 7 to go across the ocean. Which, I mean, you think about what they went through to come here. I mean, I don't even want to go to Buffalo, let alone going across the ocean.
Yeah.
For what, 3 or 4 months? No. They were brave people.
Okay, but she did ask a question, why? Why do you think God began his section on dealing with others with this whole thing on slaves or servants?
They just came out of slavery.
Oh, they were very familiar with slavery, with one form of slavery. And they had been abused, right?
Yes.
And we know from our reading and everything that abused people tend to become abusers. And we've talked before about God brought them out of Egypt, and now he's working on bringing Egypt out of them. He says, I don't want you to have that same mindset. I don't want your slavery or your servant your master-servant relationship to look like that. And that's what they'll default to because that's all they know. So he's giving them, okay, here's how we're gonna do it in our culture, in our country. Okay, and then we come to number 9. And if you sell your daughter and she becomes the wife of either the master or his son, there were some laws put into place to protect her in that situation. What kinds of protection did you find?
Redemption.
Redemption. Yeah, she could come out of it. Okay, what else?
Financial.
I'm sorry.
Financial.
Financial.
They were
Okay.
cared for.
Okay, you have to provide her food, you have to give her clothing, you have to give her her marital rights. You can't just ignore her and mistreat her. Cindy, were you gonna say something else?
She can't be sold to a foreign.
Okay, if you don't like her, you can't sell her off to some foreigner. She stays in Israel. Okay, and among her own people. And if you give her as a wife to your son, you don't treat her like a second-class citizen. She's a daughter, just as much as if she had been a free person coming in. So yeah, and I skipped over, there were also protections for the men, but again, what protections were given to men who sold themselves into slavery? That was back on the previous question. I turned the page too fast.
When they leave, they take their wife with them.
Okay, all right.
A set period of time for them.
Okay, again, you're not becoming a slave for the whole rest of your life. It's a set period of time, 6 years. And after that, you go free, and it says for nothing. So even if your debt hasn't been repaid, doesn't matter. You have served those 6 years, you go free. And you can't extort money from you for that, if they follow the law.
It was weird when you read about the men though, if there was a wife and children,
Yes.
and the men could leave, but the wife and the children had to stay, and that just seems so cruel.
Yes.
To split a family up like that.
Yes.
And again, she will address that, so I'll let that happen, and then if there's still questions afterwards, remind me. If you have a question that she doesn't answer, or give a suggested answer for. Did you think that the laws designated a harsher penalty for harming men than for women, or not? And again, this is what do you think?
Yeah, it was a patriarchal society, so they always had the upper hand, it seemed. Definitely.
And yet, there were those provisions for women, they weren't just ignored. I kind of doubt if other law codes of that era said much about women. So the very fact that God says anything about how women are to be treated, and you can't do this to her, you know, I think that in itself is kind of, they count, they matter to me, God is saying.
Well, if you compare Christianity to Islam, and the way girls are treated, even at a very, very young age. Muhammad, I can't remember the name of the book. It was the teachings of Muhammad. It's not in the Quran, it's a separate book. And Muhammad makes a statement that if your daughter starts her period, he doesn't say it that way, but if she starts her menses before she leaves your home, shame on you. So basically saying,
Marry her too.
Absolutely, your girls become wives at a very, very tender age.
Yeah.
Oh my goodness.
So.
I've known some teenage girls I'd like to sell.
Okay, and I think we've probably already addressed 11, some of the things we would have written differently, we think, you know. But I thought question 12 was interesting. Why do you think that God gives Moses laws that rather than overturn things that seem unjust, just seek to provide a way to live righteously in the midst of it? What do you think about that?
Maybe it's a reference, for them to have a reference
A reference for,
between the old law and the new law.
perhaps. Again, this is why do you think, so.
He wants us to live peaceably with the people around us, so. as much as possible without violating any of the commandments.
I think maybe he wants them to develop their own ways but live like, to honor him, you know what I mean?
Yep.
Not to force the change, but for them to want to desire to change.
As time goes on. And again, Jen addresses that thing, so I will not comment on it at this point. But the last one, number 13, the circumstances here seem very far removed from our own, but did you find some general principles that we could take from these things that we could apply? Anybody come up, have something for that?
When a wrong is committed, there needs to be a form of punishment to the one who committed the crime. There needs
Okay.
to be-
Laws are important, so, yeah. I had that willful murder is absolutely wrong, and so is kidnapping. You know, so he made provision for if you accidentally kill somebody, but that was one punishment. But what was the punishment if you deliberately did it? Or even kidnapping. If you kidnap somebody with the intent to sell them, both you and the person you sold them to, it's death. So,
He even addresses babies in the womb.
yeah, right.
And
He
that's so
does that.
important, especially what's going on today.
Another general principle is that honoring your father and mother is very serious. Again, you curse your mom and dad, you're dead. You know, we don't go that far, but, yeah, but we do need to take seriously that fifth commandment, I will honor my father and mother. Making amends for harm done to other people caught in the crossfire, you might say. I'll talk about two men fighting and a woman gets struck. Well, they weren't fighting her, but nonetheless they injured her. You gotta do something about that. Taking responsibility for situations that can cause harm. You know, don't just ignore it and say that's their problem. You know, that we are to take responsibility for situations that come to our awareness that we can do something about. Anyway, so there are some things that we can take from this, even though we don't specifically apply them. So, bear with me while we pull up. Well, okay, well, again, I had some parallels that I found in the book of 1 Peter. So that's found at the bottom of your notes in the blue print. And the first one I found in the first chapter, in phrases like, Peter is telling these believers, don't be conformed to the passions of your former ignorance. You know, you came out of some bad stuff. Conduct yourselves with fear throughout the time of your exile. That's certainly less than an ideal situation. He's not saying try to get out of your exile, but he is saying conduct yourselves in the right way through fear of God, you know, during this time that you're in exile. And he talks about the futile ways that were inherited from your forefathers. Probably all of us have some futile ways in our past. You know, from our past culture, from our childhood or whatever. And he says, leave those things behind and leave that previous way of life behind and live holy lives patterned after Christ. But then a much more clearer parallel is found in the second chapter when he's talking to servants of his day, Peter's day. And keep in mind, the servants of Peter's day maybe were more similar to the bad kind of slavery than to the good kind of slavery, or servanthood. Wouldn't have been quite as bad as Egypt, but it wasn't a good situation to be in for sure. And yet, Peter doesn't ever urge the servants to rise up in rebellion. He doesn't say cast it off. He says remain in respectful submission, following the example of Christ, who entrusted himself to the one who judges justly. So once again, circumstances are less than ideal, but God expects us to live holy lives in the midst of those circumstances and to trust him to deal with the unjust system in his timely way, because he will. And we know that, and we can rest in that. And then the third parallel I thought was what he said to husbands, that little single verse where he tells them to live with your wives in an understanding way, showing honor to the woman. Their heirs with you with the grace of God. Women count to me. You give her the honor that is due her. So God hasn't changed. And he gives similar advice for different cultures, but the same principles are followed. Okay, so with that, we'll end for today and see you all next month.